and gentlemen, I'm Zenon Stavrinides, Secretary of the Association for Cypriot, Greek and Turkish Affairs. Please come in. And I'm very happy to welcome you all at this first meeting, first seminar of the new academic year. There are old faces here, and there are new faces, and I'd like everybody to know that the association is very keen to have new people coming in. Please come in. No, please come in. Please come in. Seats over there. And if you'd like to be regularly informed of our events, you only have to give me your email, and you know it will be entered in my distribution list. I think we have a notepad that is doing the rounds. That's not good. But
it's already doing. It's already going around.
You can leave your name, because all our meetings are free and open to the public. Our aim is to present seminars where people can offer well-considered and rational views of any issue that relates to Cyprus, Greece and Turkey, and their relations and the relationships of each of these countries with Europe and the wider world. And therefore, if you are interested, you are most welcome. Now, our speaker today is Dr. James Ker-Lindsay, a man currently working here at the Hellenic Observatory, who have been offering us this lovely room. Dr. Ker-Lindsay studied at the University of London and then pursued postgraduate work in the University of Kent. I think before he got his PhD, he presented a paper to one of our seminars, and that's many years ago.
Yes.
Since then, he has lived in Cyprus. Indeed, he has close connection with both Cyprus and Greece. He has worked in Cyprus and in Greece, and he also was coordinator for the Greek-Turkish Forum of the Royal United Services Institute. He's returned to the United Kingdom in the year 2005 to take up a senior research fellowship at Kingston University, and now he has a similar post, senior research fellowship here at the Hellenic Observatory, as I said. He's published 3 books on Cyprus, and before long he will be bringing out a book on the politics and government of Cyprus, which was going to be something new, I think, in the scholarly bibliography. So, without any further ado, I'll ask James Ker-Lindsay to present his paper, which bears the title, "The Security Dimensions of a Cyprus Settlement," an area of concern. I don't have to tell you how important it is for the chances of an agreed settlement in Cyprus.
Thank you very much, Zenon, and thank you so many people for turning out. I should say that this paper actually represents a development of thinking that first emerged earlier this year at a big conference that was held over in Geneva, which I think only Mary was also at, out of the people here, which was on the idea of a constitutional convention for Cyprus. And this idea essentially evolved out of the thinking which now is shaping the current talks that are taking place in Cyprus, that any settlement has really got to come from the people of Cyprus, that numerous attempts have been made to try and reach an agreement with very active outside roles. However, these have failed for various reasons, and that maybe now, despite all the scepticism that there's been over the years about whether the Cypriots can really find a solution to the problem, that this has really now got to be given a go. And so when we were talking about this at this conference, which, as I say, was looking at all the various aspects of it, it struck me and a number of the other people there that there was one particular area where no matter how much one might want to think that this was a Cypriot issue that could be dealt with by the people of Cyprus, some sort of outside involvement would be needed. And that, of course, is the question of security. And I think that when one looks at the situation, there's all sorts of reasons why this has got to be the case. Whether one likes it or not, and I know that it's a very divisive issue, and one which I will be speaking about this evening, there is the question of Greece, Turkey and Britain, the guarantor powers in any constitutional discussions that take place at the moment. Whether they retain their role afterwards is another question, but I think at the moment it's fairly well accepted that in one way or another the three countries will have to play a part. But there's also much bigger issues of the involvement of the international community, and these are some of the questions that I hope to explore this evening. I should actually stress right from the outset, the purpose of what I'm saying this evening is not really to present a definitive answer to a lot of these questions, but really to raise the sorts of problems that exist, the sorts of issues that are going to have to be thought about now and in the months ahead as the talks continue, and sort of maybe generate a bit of debate here this evening which might provide some interesting insights into the way that certain issues can be handled. I think it's also important to stress just how central the question of security is to any settlement of the Cyprus problem. A poll taken in the hours after the close of the referendum in April 2004 indicated that 75% of no voters had cited security as their number one reason why they had voted against the UN plan. There's no doubt, certainly for the Greek Cypriots, that security is paramount in the search for a settlement. And I should actually stress that even amongst many of the Greek Cypriots who voted yes, security was a very, very grave concern. They voted yes with concerns that the security elements weren't strong enough, but they were going to take a leap of faith. I think in any start of any discussion, it's actually worth highlighting there's a fundamental problem that has got to be addressed in any attempt to address the security of the Cyprus settlement, and that is the asymmetry that exists on the island and in the region. On the island, as we know, the Greek Cypriots represent the vast majority of the population, roughly 78% versus 18% at the time of 1960. We obviously don't know exactly what the exact breakdown would be today. So essentially we could say for every one Turkish Cypriot there's 4 Greek Cypriots. Under those circumstances, it's hardly surprising that the Turkish Cypriots do have a certain degree of concern about their own security. The problem is that at the same time as the Greek Cypriots are the majority on the island, they then see themselves in regional terms as a minority. That Turkey over the water is vastly larger than Cyprus. And this presents its own problems when you come to deal with security. How do you balance that out? The Turkish Cypriots say, we need security against the Greek Cypriots, we need Turkey. At that point, the Greek Cypriots say, but hold on, Turkey's much bigger, you now present a threat to us. So any settlement has got to take on board this fundamental asymmetry that exists and this fundamental imbalance that exists between the perceptions of the two communities as to their relative strength on the island and in regional terms. And this naturally makes compromise difficult. However, in terms of the on the island situation, some moves have already been made. Perhaps most significantly is the question of demilitarisation. This was something that was proposed over a decade ago by the Ker-Lindsay administration, and it is now fairly well accepted that this will be one of the core elements of any solution. That the National Guard will be disbanded, any Turkish Cypriot forces will be disbanded. There will be police forces, obviously, but there will not be a standing military in any new state of affairs created following a solution. However, as I will point out, that raises other problems. But in terms of addressing this central security question of the relationship between the two communities, this is seen as a very important issue. The second major question, obviously, to consider is that of foreign troops on the island. one hardly needs to stress that for Greek Cypriot, the removal of Turkish troops, either in whole or the vast majority, is absolutely central in terms of any solution that's going to be reached. But likewise, for the Turkish Cypriots, this represents a fundamental red line. We know that there will have to be reductions. This was accepted in the Annan Plan, but it's a question of how we take that forward and what we're really talking about in wider terms. I think that at the same time as reducing the number of Turkish troops on the island and the consequential reduction of Greek troops, whether that means a return to the 1960 setup where you'd have 950 Greek troops, 650 Turkish troops, this is all will have to be discussed, debated, decided what we're going to aim at and how we'll get there. But I think that there needs to be some philosophical elements that are introduced into this. And I think first and foremost, if there are going to be troops remaining on the island, Greek and Turkish troops, it's a question of actually defining quite clearly what their purpose is. That they will be there to try and stabilise and protect the respective communities. I think one of the problems that has made Cyprus potentially difficult to resolve has been the way that it's actually become incorporated into a wider problem between Greece and Turkey security-wise. If you look at Cyprus and you actually think about its security position, part of the problem is that as far as Turkey sees it, that any Greek presence on the island naturally represents a threat to its southern shores. And if you consider it, that Cyprus has absolutely no defensive value for Greece. If there were to be any conflict between Greece and Turkey, Cyprus would not have any value at all for protecting the Greek mainland. So as far as Turkey sees it, the only reason there are Greek troops on the island is because they want to threaten Turkey, so that if there were a conflict, then they could try and attack Turkey. And I think that this is one of the issues which is going to actually have to be thought about very seriously in how do you get rid of this Greek-Turkish element to the security of Cyprus in any settlement. And I think it's very clear that one of the things that would have to be done is make sure that the troops that remain are very lightly armed, they don't have heavy weaponry, we get rid of naval bases, we get rid of air bases. These are things which I think would actually help to actually secure the island and make it less of an issue in terms of bilateral Greek-Turkish relations. Now, obviously, we're talking about a very different political environment between Greece and Turkey today than we would have been talking about a decade ago. That rapprochement has gone on now since 1999, and this has brought about a tremendous improvement in relations between Athens and Ankara. However, we have to recognise that there are still outstanding issues, and the question of militarisation in the Aegean as well as in Cyprus is something that is actually having a negative effect overall. So I think that, when we think about this question of the reduction of Greek and Turkish troops on the island, we also actually have to understand the underlying philosophy that's got to accompany this and plan accordingly. The next issue, obviously, to consider is the question of the Treaty of Guarantee. Yet again, this is something which is enormously contentious in any discussion between the two communities, and also as far as Ankara is concerned. Yet again, there are ways that this can be managed, this can be dealt with. I think any demands made by Nicosia, by the Greek Cypriots, that the Treaty of Guarantee has got no place in any settlement is not going to produce an agreement. It's as simple as that. This remains a red line for the Turkish Cypriot community and for Turkey. So I think the question at this stage has got to be thinking about how best one can go forward and try and create circumstances where at some point in the future the Treaty of Guarantee can be got rid of. Speaking very honestly, I think that most people who view Cyprus would agree that this idea of actually having Britain, Greece and Turkey act as guarantors of the sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence of a sovereign state is anachronistic. It's got no real place in a state in the 21st century. But at the same time, we've got to talk about the realities of trying to reach an agreement. And if this is one of these conditions that is going to be laid down in terms of reaching an agreement, then it's something that's got to be brought on board, and we've got to think about ways of getting around this. Perhaps the most obvious answer, and the one that was put forward in 2004 and has been discussed, is the idea of a sunset clause. This would essentially place a time limit on the Treaty of Guarantee. Essentially, the idea would be that at the moment that Turkey joins the European Union, the Treaty of Guarantee would cease to have any legal value. This, I think, is a very good idea. It's one that deserves to be explored. There are obvious problems. What happens if Turkey's accession process runs into difficulties? This is something that I think is going to have to be accepted as a natural risk that one has got to take with this. But I think the idea of having a Treaty of Guarantee clause, an amendment which would say this becomes null and void when Turkey joins the European Union, is a tremendously positive idea that really does deserve to be explored in greater detail in any future talks. There have been other ideas that have been put forward as well for how one might be able to manage the Treaty of Guarantee. One particular suggestion that has been claimed is that, well, how about having a system where before any of the guarantor powers can act, they must receive Security Council authorization? That essentially would be a non-starter. It's not going to provide an answer to this particular question, because Turkey would simply say we're not going to have any sort of limitation like that imposed on our action. That by the time discussions take place in the Security Council, what happens if Russia blocks it? We can't act. It's an illegal act. No, absolutely unacceptable. So I think that, for example, that sort of idea doesn't have much value. Likewise, another idea that was put forward was how about introducing a system that would create some limitations on the action of Turkish forces, for example, or Greek forces, so that essentially Turkish forces would be situated in the Turkish Cypriot component state, Greek forces in the Greek Cypriot component state. They would not be able to cross the boundary into the other component state in the case that there was difficulties or problems. While in theory that sounds like a good idea, that would actually probably be rejected by the Greek Cypriots on the basis that that would cement partition. If Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots cannot feel secure to actually be able to move around the island, and for Greek Cypriots to live in the Turkish part and the Turkish Cypriots to perhaps live in the Greek component part, because the troops could not step in and save them if anything were to happen, I think that you would find that many people would just not take the risk and remain embedded in their respective communities. And so in fact, there is actually a fairly good argument to be said that that sort of idea might actually be counterproductive in terms of trying to generate much more intermixture between the two communities following a settlement. Moving on from that, which obviously those questions are fairly significant issues which are going to have to be thought about, we then have got to consider other elements of a settlement that have got to be introduced. The second major factor to look at is the question of peacekeeping. It's fairly well accepted that any settlement will require the continuation of a peacekeeping force in Cyprus. However, that does not mean that, as has been the case in other places such as Cambodia, Kosovo, East Timor, that they will have any significant administrative capabilities. I mention this because it has been an idea that has been put forward by my very good friend Oliver Richmond a couple of years ago in a paper he wrote in International Affairs. And it's one idea that I think attracted a lot of interest, but I have disagreed with him on this for a number of reasons. Partly and mainly because Cyprus is not like Kosovo. Cyprus is not like East Timor. This is a functioning democratic state. All right, it perhaps does not function in the way that the 1960 constitution had originally envisaged, but this is a country which I don't think any reasonable outside observer could say needs international administration. For the UN to go in there and take control of various parts of the government and administration of the island, even on a temporary basis in terms of acting as a transition authority. You then run into very, very significant other problems about having the UN act as a transitional authority in an EU member state, and how would that work, and political lines of authority and control and communication. For a similar reason, I would also argue that any idea that the EU could play a role, which has been an idea that has also been put forward, runs into similar problems, perhaps even greater problems. Who would then, from the European Union, act as the overall authority, if you like, of this transitional EU administration? The idea that the EU would effectively then take over the administration of one of its own member states, well, you know, the inherent paradoxes and contradictions that could throw up are fairly clear. But it is something, as I say, that is worth mentioning from the outset. That there will not, certainly as I see it, need to be any sort of significant administrative capability in even a transitional element in a settlement. That raises the second question as to what type of peacekeeping force we would need. Would we need a traditional peacekeeping force or a peace observation mission? To briefly explain the difference between the two, a peacekeeping force tends to be a much larger undertaking. Exactly the sort of mission that we've seen in Cyprus with the United Nations force in Cyprus since 1964. It's composed of a number of fairly large contingents. It has a very sizable, clear presence on the ground, whereas a peace observation mission tends to be very small. You can have peace observation missions with maybe a couple of dozen members, very lightly armed, are there just to keep literally a very light touch overview of a situation. There are arguments for having both types of mission in Cyprus. For example, advocates of a peace observation mission would actually point out that recent events over the past 5 years have shown that there wouldn't actually need to be anything much bigger. Since the line has opened in April 2003 until the present, the number of serious incidents between Greek and Turkish Cypriots has been minimal. I cannot say immediately what that figure is, but it's very, very small number of incidents. As one prominent Greek Cypriot lawyer said to me, you've had more incidents at an average Nicosia derby football match, Saturday afternoon football match, than you've had between Greek and Turkish Cypriots since the line has opened. So in that sense, a lot of people have said, well, you know, do we need to have a significant peacekeeping presence in Cyprus after a settlement? I would say that we probably do. Although we have seen a reduction in the size of UNFICYP, a 30% reduction after the 2004 referendum, and we all accept that relations between the two communities have worked out so far a lot better than a lot of the pessimists predicted. Certainly Ralph Dentash at the time of 2003 when the line opened, one of his arguments in favour of doing this was, we'll open it, there'll be incidents, people will see that we can't live together, we'll close the line down again. And that actually hasn't obviously happened. However, polling has shown that 43% of Greek Cypriots have cited that their greatest concern after a settlement is that if things don't work out, there is the potential for clashes between the two communities. And that is the single largest concern noted by Greek Cypriots about the implications of a settlement. And I think that the general feeling is that we would need to have a fairly sizable peacekeeping mission on the island, at least for an interim period, perhaps increase the number as we've seen at UNFICYP at the moment, just to make sure things work out, just to have a strong presence there, available, ready to act, and showing that there is this commitment to peacekeeping and an international commitment to make sure that things won't necessarily get out of hand. So that's the second element of any discussion on trying to deal with the security element of a Cyprus settlement. The third element is one which hardly is ever mentioned, and that's external defence. In all the discussions about solving Cyprus, I very, very rarely hear anyone say, well, what happens to the defence of the island? What happens if we get rid of a National Guard, a defence force? What happens if there is any threat from abroad? Now, there are obviously countries that don't have militaries. Iceland, for example, is one, and as a member of NATO, yes, Iceland at the moment.
So the terrorist list, I think.
Yeah, on the terrorist list, absolutely.
This country is about to attack us.
Yes, I think that
Send in the gunships.
perhaps not the best choice to bring up at the moment,
No.
but there are countries which don't have defence forces.
We have another example.
I believe Costa Rica doesn't have a military. Anyone else might know of countries which have been completely demilitarised?
Puerto Rico.
Well, that's under US.
Switzerland.
No, Switzerland has an extremely strong military.
Oh, you mean national. National.
Ireland, practically. Ireland.
No, Ireland has. The IRA.
Well, peacekeeping
Yeah.
missions, then we wouldn't. Well, a game for everyone to play. If you can think of any others, sort of perhaps in the question and answer, bring it up. But this is something that obviously one has got to consider, and this was the point when I said earlier that about this discussion of demilitarisation, there is a factor that hasn't been taken into account, which is what happens for the defence of Cyprus. Now, Cyprus obviously exists in a very dangerous part of the world. Having said that, it has extremely good relations with many of its neighbours, Turkey obviously notwithstanding. And so one could say, well, would it really need a military? I think it's one of those questions that one has to look ahead and consider where things might be going. Take on board the fact that Cyprus is a member of the European Union. Yes, the European Union currently has fairly good relations with many of the countries in the Middle East, but could we see this in the future? Could we, looking ahead, maybe 1, 2, 3 decades, argue that this will be the same, in which case Cyprus represents the eastern outpost of Europe and might well come under threat. And so I think that this is something that does deserve to be thought about in some way or another and considered. One argument that has been put forward, it was actually put forward, interesting enough, in the Cyprus Mail by Andreas Theophanos in a piece he wrote in the last Sunday's Cyprus Mail, was saying, well, perhaps it's time that we reconsider this idea of demilitarisation, that maybe Cyprus should retain a small professional military force in the event of a settlement. I would actually argue that there might be something in this, notwithstanding the questions that we discussed mentioned earlier about the relations between the two communities and the way that demilitarisation comes into this. This might be something worth exploring, but one must also consider that it was, after all, the question of the Cyprus army which was one of the key issues which provoked problems between the two communities after the 1960 constitution came into force. As many of you will probably be aware, in most elements of government administration, the split between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots was 70-30. However, in the armed forces, it would have been 60-40. The problem was that there was a fundamental disagreement between the two communities about what exactly that meant. Did that mean that you would have split units, that you would have Greek Cypriot units, and so for every 6 Greek Cypriot units you would have 4 Turkish Cypriot units, or did that mean that you would have mixtures? So within a unit, 60% would be Greek Cypriots, 40% Turkish Cypriots. Now, of course, the Greek Cypriots wanted to go for the mixture within units. The Turkish Cypriots insisted they had to be separate, and they would do it on the basis of 4 to 6. That could well be the sort of issue that might crop up again and serve to create unnecessary problems between the two communities as they're discussing things at the moment. However, this idea of perhaps looking to have a small professional force is something that might be worth keeping on the table. But if that weren't to happen, what would be the other alternatives that one could explore? The first one, and please let me finish my sentence first before anyone gets upset, is to have Turkey undertake that responsibility. The obvious answer to that, of course, is that that would be completely unacceptable to the Greek Cypriots. The idea that Cyprus would somehow become a protectorate, no matter how strong the Turkish armed forces and well placed they would be able to protect the island in the event of an attack, would just simply be something that no Greek Cypriot would be willing to accept. One must also consider that there is perhaps also the danger that such a system could actually put Cyprus at greater risk rather than less risk. Turkey certainly has made tremendous strides in improving its relations with all its neighbours over the past 5 or 6 years. One need look only at what is, for example, the relations with Syria, the relations with Iraq, with Iran. Its recent suggestion, for example, in taking a lead in trying to come up with some sort of defence and security community in the Caucasus is another example of this, rapprochement being another. However, these relationships are always, again, in danger of potential collapse. And I'm sure that Cyprus wouldn't want to see itself become enmeshed in any sorts of difficulties that Turkey might have with any of its neighbours. The second alternative that could be put forward is that Britain would take on that role. But again, I think that that would be something that would be completely unacceptable to the Greek Cypriots, but I think that you would find that there would be absolutely no appetite whatsoever in London for that to happen. The bases serve a particular purpose, they have a particular role, but it's perhaps not as strong as many people would like to imagine. We saw, for example, in 2004, in advance of the referendum, that there was a very clear offer by the British government to give up part of the bases and have that return to Cyprus authority under any terms of any settlement. I should mention that this is something that has been brought up before, and people have said, well, why doesn't Britain give up part of this territory if it doesn't want it? The problem is that it could provoke a land grab. Any settlement, any return of territory would have to be returned to the Republic of Cyprus, at which point the Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, well, the Turkish Cypriots would say, but part of that territory should come to us. And so I think that that has tended to complicate any discussions about handing over territory out of the context of a settlement. But I think that certainly you would want to see, I think London would prefer to see a reduction in its role in Cyprus rather than any increase in its role in Cyprus in terms of a settlement. So I think that one would actually have to look further afield and discuss the role of other actors in all of this. Now, I think, as I mentioned, there's two elements that have got to be considered in the wider international security element. There's the peacekeeping element and there's the external security, which needs to be taken into account in any of these discussions. The first body to be considered in any discussion on Cyprus security is the United Nations, of course. The United Nations now has been responsible for peacekeeping on the island since 1964, so 44 years of peacekeeping. By and large, it's done a very good job of that. It's earned a lot of respect in that role. But perhaps there is a feeling for a fresh start, that maybe in the event of a settlement, that a new body should take over from the United Nations. I'll look at some of the other alternatives. But I personally think that the United Nations will probably remain the best option for conducting peacekeeping in Cyprus after a settlement. In terms of external defence, obviously this is not something that one could envisage the United Nations being able to undertake in any sort of meaningful way as a defence force. I mean, quite apart from the fact that you have questions of manpower, equipment, political will, also will shape thinking on this. Does the United Nations Secretariat want to even open up that can of worms of trying to run and organise and coordinate a proper defence force under UN auspices? The second option to consider is NATO. This is an idea that has become and found increasing support in Greek Cypriot circles. Certain Greek Cypriot circles, I should say. For example, VC has made it clear that it would be in favour of a NATO role in Cyprus following a settlement. But of course one runs into the problems of the current government and their position. The ACL government has remained very opposed to any sort of role of NATO in Cyprus or any participation of Cyprus in any sort of NATO fora. For example, Cyprus is one of the few countries in Europe, and by that I mean extended Europe to include Central Asia, which is not a member, for example, of Partnership for Peace, and is not likely to become so under this government. Now, traditionally, Greek Cypriot opposition to NATO involvement in Cyprus was based on two factors. First and foremost, there was a concern that in any event that problems arose, if Cyprus was a member of NATO, Turkey is a member of NATO, that the natural inclination would be for NATO to take the side of the Turkish government. This was a position that was taken in 1960. When Cyprus first became independent, there was a discussion on this. It was put on the table, and the Greek Cypriot, Archbishop Makarios and the Greek Cypriot cabinet at that point did not want Cyprus to join NATO for that reason, and this is outlined by Clarides in his memoirs. But of course there's another element, which is the ACL element, the very strong relationship with Russia. During the Cold War, Cyprus's non-alignment, this was considered very important, especially after 1974, in making sure that there wasn't widespread recognition of the TRNC. And so I think that, for a number of reasons, one's seen that ACL has not wanted to pursue that. But I think that also you can look to more contemporary reasons why ACL and some Greek Cypriots would be very opposed to having a NATO involvement in Cyprus. Primarily, again, because of Russian concerns about this. I mean, we've seen, for example, this summer a graphic illustration of what happens and what has been Russia's response to the idea of NATO expansion up to its borders in the case of Georgia. And I think that Cyprus, the Cypriot government under President Christofias, is not going to want to antagonise Russia by then seeing Cyprus effectively either become a member of NATO or a NATO protectorate. There is a very interesting relationship between Cyprus and Russia that one has got to consider. That Russia performs a very useful role for Cyprus in the Security Council, and likewise Cyprus is performing a very useful role for Russia in certain fora such as the Council of Europe, and in most notably now within the European Union. And so there's a very close relationship that exists between the two, certainly under this government, which I think that the government would want to see maintained. But there's also a question as to whether Turkey would in fact actually want to see a significant NATO role in Cyprus. At the same time, in 1960, as the Greek Cypriots were opposed to Cyprus becoming a member of NATO, so too was Turkey opposed to Cyprus becoming a member of NATO, because it believed that in actual fact, if Cyprus were a member of NATO, its ability to act if it needed to would be severely hampered. So in actual fact, after 1960, the one element that actually of agreement between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish government was actually over Cyprus's membership of NATO and the opposition to that. And I wonder if under contemporary circumstances one might not see also a degree of the same thinking in Turkey as to whether NATO should take a formal role in Cyprus and the implications that might have for its own need to act if it, although one would like to think that that wouldn't now happen, but should it happen, then whether Turkey would have concerns about the implications of being a member of NATO. The third element is the European Union. This is obviously something that finds considerable support, certainly in Greek Cypriot circles. There's been a lot of discussion, European solution, why can't the European Union take a much more active role? Why can't the European Union guarantee the security of Cyprus? There are a number of problems that trying to approach the European Union to manage the security question would actually have to address and deal with. For a start, there's limited capabilities. How would the European Union be able to put together a significant force to be able to undertake either peacekeeping and or defence capabilities in Cyprus? And even if it could, the chances are it would actually have to involve NATO. But more importantly, I think one would find that this would be rejected by the Turkish Cypriots and Turkey on the grounds that the European Union cannot play an impartial role in Cyprus. That by virtue of the fact that Greece is a member of the European Union, by virtue of the fact that the Greek Cypriots, Cyprus is a member of the European Union and Turkey isn't, that this cannot, the European Union could not act as a neutral broker. There would also be questions about the operational elements of this. It's not just at a grand political scale that one would have this problem, but what about day-to-day coordination, political authority? Even if you could remove the Greek Cypriots from any European Union decision-making, Turkey would say, well, will Greece also be barred from taking part in any of that decision making as well, as a minimum requirement, and that would in turn raise certain questions, I think, within the European Union. But one must also consider that it could become a very serious bone of contention between Turkey and the European Union itself. If the EU were to be in place in Cyprus and incidents were to take place and the European Union didn't act, what would be the implications if Turkey decided to act against the European Union? And I think for this reason Ankara would be very opposed to the idea of actually having an EU mission in place to try and manage any of the security elements. It's problematic enough with the United Nations, but I don't think that they would also want to then see their own accession path being potentially jeopardised by difficulties over security elements in Cyprus. So what other alternatives can we look to? One immediate other suggestion would be the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. This is an interesting organisation which would perhaps be worth exploring simply because it draws together all the interested parties, as well as Cyprus, Greece and Turkey, Britain, the United States and Russia, all participate in the OSCE. And so it actually has that sort of overarching element that I think everyone could perhaps live with. It's also extremely adept at dealing with conflict and post-conflict situations. It's operated in a number of very, very difficult environments, and I think in contrast to many of the places it operates, that Cyprus would be a relatively benign environment for it to act. But yet again, you would have major questions about how that would work in real terms if you were to have a significant OSCE mission. And it would, in all probability, be unable to deal once again with the major defence of the island issue, even though it could probably carry out a lot of the peacekeeping tasks very well. So the final idea that perhaps has been put on the table is some sort of UN Security Council guarantee that would essentially say Cyprus remains demilitarised, that there are no formal bodies put in place to manage the external security of Cyprus. Yes, you have a peacekeeping mission, but there would be some sort of Security Council resolution put in place, which would be put in place under Chapter 7, which is relates to actions with respect to peace. But then you would also have questions again about enforcement. How would this resolution operate? Under what terms? Would it need a further Security Council resolution to authorise action? These are very, very big issues that would actually have to be considered under this scheme. But it may be something there that could be hammered out with some sort of teeth. So it's an idea that potentially has some benefits, but it's hard to see at this moment what those are. Anyway, I think, as I say, I'd really like to sort of move on to sort of try and encourage some sort of discussion on this. So really just to sum up, I think that to say when one looks at the security situation in Cyprus, it is one of the issues which will require some sort of outside involvement. That is clear. For all sorts of reasons, there is going to have to be some wider international involvement in efforts to manage security in Cyprus following a settlement. But in trying to consider all these aspects, one's got to take into account that there's three essential levels, if you like, that have got to be managed. There's the island-wide level, there's the regional level, and then there's obviously the international level. And it's trying to work out all of these and balance these, which can actually become very difficult and potentially complicate. So you think you might have found the answer in one, such as demilitarisation, but it opens up another set of problems that have perhaps not really been envisaged before. I think, talking about the regional element, again, it's absolutely vital to stress this point that Cyprus needs to be delinked from Greek-Turkish relations and Greek-Turkish bilateral disputes and difficulties. I think this is something that one would probably find would be very, very strongly welcome both in Athens and Ankara, but it's a question of finding the way there. Obviously, as long as Cyprus remains on the agenda, as long as Cyprus remains a problem, it has actually made finding overall settlement of Greek-Turkish disputes in the Aegean, for example, much more difficult. So one could see that in many ways a solution would resolve the problem. of Cyprus's place in that dynamic between Greece and Turkey, but it is something to be stressed that any solution, I think, and talking about having Greek and Turkish troops in Cyprus, would actually have to recognise that those troops would be there to play a very limited role, and it wouldn't be about maintaining significant military presence in the form of air bases or naval bases. Again, the idea on the Treaty of Guarantee, the sunset clause is a very good idea that I think deserves to be given a lot of attention in any discussions at the moment. But perhaps there are other ideas that can be put forward regarding the Treaty of Guarantee. Regarding peacekeeping, again, the United Nations represents probably the best option, but there are other routes that can be explored and should be explored and can be discussed. But perhaps most crucially of all is this question of external security. And this is one, I think, which hasn't been discussed enough and is perhaps the most thorny issue of all. Thank you.
I thank James Ker-Lindsay for what I regard as very thorough presentation or overview of the security aspect of Cyprus settlement. Before I throw the discussion open to the audience, can I ask, there are a number of people out there, please come in. Are you sure you're happy there? There may be, there are some chairs in there. All right, okay. The other thing I'd like to mention is that maybe you're realizing that high-tech friend and associate of this organization is making a video which he'd like to upload on the internet. So if there's anybody who might wish to ask a question, he doesn't want his question and his contribution to be given a broadcast, yes, should perhaps indicate so. I don't know whether it's possible to take it out in due course.
Well, I would ask that if anybody objects, if they sit behind me, then they're highly unlikely to get taped.
All right. I'd like to ask people if they have any questions or comments, please be brief and succinct so we can have as many questions as possible. Who would like to make a start? Mr. Argyros.
You stated in your speech here on the fact that Greece is looking upon Cyprus in a benign manner and doesn't have any designs on it for defensive purposes. However, there is the strange fact that Turkey has 37,000 troops in the north of the island, number one. Number two, when Turkey wishes to move militarily for its own purposes, i.e. to move into Iraq after the pursuit of the Kurds, it does so. Thirdly, how can you state that NATO is not involved in Cyprus? There are two sovereign areas on the island which belong to the UK. That is British land. And what I find bewildering is why the Greek Cypriots tolerate that existing situation in which their land is occupied by the British troops and they don't do anything about it. So there are glaring contradictions in your summary, and much as I would like to see a peaceful settlement, I think that there is an element of dreaming in it, and that I think the most realistic solution would be indefinite partition, Greece and Greece, Cyprus and Turkish Cyprus to be completely separated.
Okay. I'm not quite actually very sure how glaring contradiction. The point I was trying to make was that if you look at the dynamic between Turkey and Greece, and you look at a map, and you have Greece, you have Turkey, you have Cyprus, the presence of the Turkish troops in Cyprus is obviously a very big issue. I spoke about it, and I'm happy to speak more about it, but just talking first about this point that you made. If there were to be a conflict between Greece and Turkey, the role of Cyprus would be, for example, would have no defensive value for Greece. If there were to be a conflict between Greece and Turkey, Greek troops in Cyprus would be actually putting the defence of Greece at risk. Those troops could be better deployed defending Greek islands in the Aegean. Cyprus has no defensive value for Greece. At the same time, I was arguing that Cyprus has, and perhaps didn't make this clear enough, Cyprus has no offensive value for Turkey in terms of any conflict with Greece. Why launch an attack from Cyprus on Greece when you would just launch it directly from Turkey? So the point I was trying to make is that actually very important that Cyprus effectively gets removed from this relationship. And it's actually better for Cyprus that it's removed from this relationship, that it doesn't become part of this overall problem that might exist between Greece and Turkey. Fortunately, as I say, relations are very good at the moment, and let's hope that with a settlement, if we are moving in that way, relations will become a lot better. I'm very confident that they will, but I think that it's also worth recognising. No, I know you perhaps your view on the Cyprus settlement, but certainly in terms of bilateral Greek-Turkish relations, if there's a Cyprus settlement, I think we would see a tremendous improvement in bilateral Greek-Turkish relations, that it would remove that last particularly thorny issue of contention. I can go into all sorts of details why I believe the Aegean could be fairly easily solved if there was a Cyprus solution. But essentially the point I was making there was that, you know, part of the problem is that Cyprus has become real estate for both Greece and Turkey in terms of their bilateral relations and in terms of their strategic understanding of that relationship. And that's actually become problematic for Cyprus and made it more difficult to reach a settlement. So that's why I'm proposing that under any discussions, you've got to remove that element. Now, I mean, talking about the bases, look, this is another very big issue that I didn't touch upon. Perhaps I should have, and go straight. Something will need to really be thought about with the bases, and it's fairly clear that there will be, the question of the bases will be opened after a settlement. Greek Cypriots and politicians from all across the spectrum have made this clear that, look, this is something that they will want to bring onto the agenda following a settlement. However, there is absolutely nothing to be gained by trying to bring that onto the agenda at the moment. That the government sees no purpose. President Christofias has said it, President Papadopoulos agreed with this, President Clerides agreed, President Vassiliou, all of them have been, there is no point bringing up the discussion of the bases while Cyprus remains divided, and the main task has got to be reunification. Why to create that problem? And so that's why it hasn't been brought up. But nobody's under any illusions that following a settlement that it won't be discussed and it won't be brought onto the table. You know, there's been parliamentary resolutions to this effect. So that's why it hasn't been discussed.
No, but the point he was making is that it's as good as being in NATO because of the British bases. I think that's his point.
No, well, the bases have a very ambiguous position and a very difficult position. I believe actually Cedric Clay back there might be able to provide a much clearer. I don't know if this was something you wanted to perhaps speak on.
No, it wasn't.
Right, okay. I just wondered if that was why your hand was up, sort of make a comment on this. But it doesn't fall strictly. I don't know exactly what would be the precise requirement regarding bases and NATO, but it doesn't fall within that overall conception in quite the same way. And Cyprus isn't, you can't argue because the basis of there, Cyprus is already, there is some sort of NATO component in
legally,
on the
no.
island. No, there isn't.
There's not a NATO component, even though there are British bases on the island?
Legally.
No, I would say on balance there isn't. There isn't. You can.
None that
take
would
the
upset
view.
the Russians. The Russians are all upset about it.
No.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's actually the clearest answer. The fact that the Russians aren't making a big deal out of it. This was part of the 1960 agreement. This was sovereign territory. Cyprus was non-aligned. It's remained non-aligned. That's never serious. Well, it had to give up non-alignment when it joined the European Union, but that's never seriously been questioned. So the fact of NATO actually having some sort of nefarious role over the future of Cyprus since 1960, I think one can say, well, it hasn't been that way. I mean, if you want to talk about 1974, then there's a whole set of different issues. But look, this, in terms of NATO and the overall scope of role in Cyprus, no, it hasn't had that.
Can I ask Edward? Can I ask Edward Clay to express his thought?
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that talk. It was very stimulating and it's a really good problem. And I just had some reactions that I'd like to offer. I think there's a very straightforward reason why Cyprus joining NATO is not attractive to anybody. And that is that the three guarantor powers are all members of NATO, and they were all members of NATO at the time when two of them were conspiring to divide up Cyprus at different times. So it doesn't have a good history. And I think just going on from that, the idea of a sunset clause pegged to Turkey's accession to the EU, it sounds okay, but is the EU likely to be any better at creating amity of itself, just through the act of accession, where long-standing alliance has not? After all, alliances are usually about military affairs. You would have thought that NATO would have been a better way of organising these things than EU accession, but perhaps it won't. I mean, one thing that really does seem to me worth considering is there are other examples of states, but they're mostly statelets. I mean, Andorra, Monaco, San Marino, there are a few which are defenceless.
Malta, is it?
Malta's got forces. Vatican City has ornamental soldiers. How many divisions has the Pope? But so there are precedents. They're mostly sort of enclaved states, and they survive through a clear understanding that they won't be used by anybody else as a jumping off point to attack their nearest neighbour. That's the key characteristic. On that basis, their nearest neighbour gets on with them and people drive through them and don't even notice they've been there. But what about a declaration of neutrality linked to demilitarisation? In which Cyprus is declared to the world, that's what we are, and the world says, yes, and that is what we will respect. The question of defence then would become a question for the Security Council, which it could not avoid being in any event. And it would come also in a more prosaic way to a question of patrols against gun running, drug smuggling, terrorism. Now those are much more manageable problems. They're manageable by border agencies at airports and coast guards at sea. It might even be that those could be areas of cooperation, as they already are between the EU members and between the EU and Turkey. Could become an area of cooperation for the two communities, acting to patrol their space, and not just on each other's territorial waters, but around the whole island, under the supervision of a small residual UN force. Maybe. An idea.
James,
I had to smile when you brought up that first issue of the EU and sunset clause and whether the EU would be able to protect the communities, because the last person who said that to me was Ralph Denktash. I posed this question. I said, look, when you join the European Union, you won't need this idea of military security. This is just not how the European Union is structured. It's not the way that the European Union works. the fundamental principles of the European Union are obviously that member states will not threaten or use force against each other under any circumstances. And his immediate reaction was, but that's now, what happens if the EU collapses? What happens if the EU becomes dysfunctional? And I remember thinking at the time, you're such a dinosaur, but one can envisage certain circumstances. So in that sense, yes, you could say, but at that point it would become irrelevant anyway, I think, whether there's a sunset clause or whether there's a treaty of guarantee or not. If the EU collapses, conflict breaks out in Cyprus, I think Turkey's just going to act anyway, in that sense. But also I think it's actually worth mentioning that in Turkey, importantly, I think there's been a fundamental shift in thinking about the importance of the European Union. We saw that with not the Chief of the General Staff who's just left, Buyukhanuk, but his predecessor, General Hilmi Özkök, who gave a very important interview, I think it was about a year or so before the attempt at resolution in 2004, to a major Greek newspaper, in which he said, look, if Turkey joins the European Union, Cyprus, the Aegean issues will be solved in a week. And he made it clear that he got it. He understood what the European Union was about, that this was about non-conflictual conflict resolution, that this would have no place, a treaty of guarantee, an idea of Turkish military intervention in Cyprus if Turkey were to join the European Union. And I think, notwithstanding the fact that the current Chief of General Staff is considered far more hardline than General Özkök, he essentially pretty much made the same statement fairly recently. So I think that there is actually hope that within the Turkish military they understand that EU membership will naturally require a very, very different way of thinking. This idea of a militarised approach to conflict resolution goes out of the window. Turkey joins the European Union, that just moves off the table. So in that sense, I think something like a sunset clause probably does have some sort of value, if only psychological at this stage for the Greek Cypriots. As I say, if everything goes wrong, it's not going to matter anyway. I just wanted to, the idea of a declaration of neutrality, yes, interesting idea, and I think that would have, perhaps would be included in this, but I think sort of my concern again runs, looking ahead a little bit, and what happens, we see the European Union at the moment, an embodiment of soft power, but what happens if the European Union starts to change? What if it evolves? What if it starts to take on a much stronger role in world affairs, a militarised role, that it starts to, Cyprus then cannot just simply be a neutral part of the European Union. It's an intrinsic part of what might actually become a far stronger political body, which may or may not then develop conflictual relations with countries in the Middle East, at which point Cyprus becomes the nearest obvious target in the European Union to attack. And so that was part of the reason, but maybe at that point then the European Union would be in a position to deal with security, so it becomes a moot point again. So I think sort of part of my thinking was not just the here and now, but perhaps also sort of thinking a little bit ahead as to how we manage security issues. And also, I mean, I think it's sort of clear, sitting here in the UK to be saying, well, maybe Cyprus should be demilitarised, that there's no problem. But, I wonder how people in Cyprus, it hasn't been discussed, it hasn't been brought up, people haven't spoken about this, but how many people would say, what happens to the external defence of Cyprus? They think of demilitarisation simply in terms of on the island between the two communities, but nobody ever really discusses what that means in terms of getting rid of a National Guard and having nothing in its place. So I guess those would be my responses to those points.
I'll ask another question. I think Manu over there wanted to ask something. No? The gentleman over here? You want to say
I just want to, you're playing forward 10 years' time, 15 years' time, improved situation, maybe Turkey is join the EU. Where is the external threat going to come from, and why is it going to be such a big issue? Because the nearest other neighbours are countries like Lebanon and Syria and Egypt, and I can't really see that there would be an attack from there, certainly not a conventional attack. The only power that would be able to do it in current technologies would be somebody like Iran with a missile attack. So in those circumstances, I don't see why it's such a contentious issue, because if that happened and it killed Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, I'm pretty sure that both Turkey and Greece and the rest of Europe and America and everybody else would be pretty angry about that situation and would intervene. So I'm not quite sure why it's such a big issue, and there's probably the more contentious issues to deal with would be the issues around peacekeeping and those such issues.
I think it's because, as I say, one's got to be aware that it is. I think it is a dangerous neighbourhood. We've seen that there is instability, and I can see where you're coming from on that. But I don't know if I feel confident having security and defence after the fact. That if there was a major attack on Cyprus, then European Union, United States, Turkey would act. What about ensuring defending Cyprus before that happens? And I think that there is that's probably the single strongest response to that. But point well taken. I mean, looking at the current environment, it is difficult to see where specific problems would come from. But then again, if we look back 18 years to 1990 to try and have played up where the various threats have come from since then, one couldn't envisage it. And I think that this is it. It is taking this into account in any discussion about security, trying to think about, well, under worst case scenarios, what do we do? And whether people would feel confident about not having a security force at all, and a statement of neutrality backed up by, well, yes, if anything happens, we will then act. I don't know if that would be enough for people.
Helen, yes.
Yeah. I haven't understood why there is this discussion of not having a Cypriot national army. And also, I assume that a solution, a settlement, would encourage a national feeling, a Cypriot national feeling, in which you want to defend your country. So I don't understand why one starts from the premise that we have to think about not having a national army, if you like, because of what happened in the past. I mean, we are hoping that the future, we can't just take blind leaps if also the settlement does not encourage a national identity and national loyalty.
I think it was simply because, as I said, you've got the twin problem. A defence force is essentially holds the power of violence on an island, in a country. I mean, it's armed, it's got those. Having a defence force in Cyprus, is this something which could become a source of much more violence if things did go wrong? This is just the thinking that went behind demilitarisation. And secondly, there were very significant problems in the structuring of the armed forces following 1960. Yes. And I think that people have looked at that and said, you know what, maybe we would just simply be better off, and very much thought of in terms of Cyprus and relations between the two communities. Let's not have this problem at all by not having a defence force at all. And this, as I say, was an idea that was most prominently put forward by President Ker-Lindsay over a decade ago, and very, very well received. And it's now become, I think, part of conventional wisdom on what a solution would include. I mean, it had it in the Annan plan, and I think that most people have generally thought, well, any settlement will have demilitarisation. But there is a discussion to be had. And again, this point of what I was trying to say this evening was just really to throw on the table these sorts of arguments and these ideas that have been put forward and say, look, maybe there is room for a discussion, that maybe things have moved on, that maybe Cypriots would say, we do need to defend this island. We don't need to have, massive forces. But if we have a well-trained, well-armed, small defence force which is capable of carrying out air defence, some naval duties, and not just against maybe big threats, but also, I think, as the point was raised, about other issues of drug trafficking, gun running, don't necessarily like the idea of using security forces for illegal immigration purposes, but these are the sorts of issues that we must also consider when talking about security. And I think maybe in those terms, yes, this is a debate that should be had. Have we been too quick to say that demilitarisation should be moved off the table when in fact it might actually, having a small Cypriot national force could serve a purpose, an important purpose?
Kirako, I think you wanted to ask something.
Yes, on the two points really. The first and the most important one is the question of the Treaty of Guarantee, and I think out of the 4 security issues you elaborated on, the Treaty of Guarantee is the more important, the most important one, in the sense also that it is a topical one, having the talks going on. Now, the first argument, of course, is that the Land of Zurich Agreement was signed in 1960. Now it's 2008. And then the most important part of the argument is that Cyprus is a member of the European Union. It changes the whole approach, I think. But if it proves to be one of the really difficult issues, then your proposal is the most realistic one. When Turkey will become member of the European Union, there wouldn't be, in practical sense anyway, practical terms, there wouldn't be any need for such a guarantee. But then no one knows whether Turkey will be a member. Could one think of the arrangement of a review of the issue, let us say 15 years' time? If and when Turkey will become a member, that would be a question of 10 years, 12 years from now. No one knows, of course. In 15 years' time, you have a review of the issue. In the light of any incidents, in the light of the situation as a whole. That's an idea. Now the second point, you very well spoke of the idea that Cyprus, or the Cyprus issue, should be delinked from the relations between the two countries. That would be ideal, of course. In practical terms, most people's experience, that's my experience as well, no solution of the Cyprus question, even in terms of today's situation as Cyprus member of the European Union, wouldn't be, how shall I say, a guarantee for the future unless the relations between the two so-called mother countries become better and better, and they have, of course. I think you refer to that. You cannot, well, it's a wish. If it could be delinked, I don't see that prospect. So, the Cyprus issue necessarily should be approached in the light also, apart from anything else, of relations between Greece and Turkey. And it's a good thing that up to now, at least in the last 5 years or so, we are in much better situation than we were.
James.
Well, I think, again, there are all sorts of options which I think are going to need to be discussed over all of these issues, Treaty of Guarantee, other ideas that can be put in place. I think, sort of turning to the second point about Greece and Turkey, my point was not to say that Greece and Turkey don't have a role in Cyprus one way or another. One can't deny that for all sorts of reasons Greece and Turkey are linked. The point I was making is that recognising that by having Greece and Turkey view Cyprus as, for want of a better expression, strategic real estate in terms of their bilateral relations is very problematic, and that one of the most positive steps that could be taken, which would not only help to improve bilateral relations between Athens and Ankara, but would also remove the temptation to use Cyprus in future as a weapon, one against the other, would be to say, for both countries, to say, look, we only have a presence in Cyprus in as much as it's there to protect, under the very worst case scenario, our communities. And this does not mean that we need to have full-scale naval facilities, air facilities. It would just be a short-term stopgap measure before the UN hopefully would be able to put a stop to any major fighting or whatever peacekeeping force, that in the very, very worst case scenario. And that's really the point I was trying to make. It wasn't to say that there would be a complete political delinking between Greece and Turkey and Cyprus. You know, Cyprus will always have special relations with both countries for very obvious reasons. But it was simply, as I say, to remove that strategic element, if you like, that I think has not only damaged efforts to try and find a solution in Cyprus, but has also played a very negative role in terms of Greece and Turkey's bilateral relationship with one another.
Alper, I think you have a question.
Well, I've got three comments. They may be wrapped up in a question in the end, if you don't mind, but I'll be quick. First of all, I agree with Helen that it's completely conceptually unsound of a country to say that it's going not to have a standing army. How you deal with it and how you make sure that it's not an army that's designed to set one community against the other is a separate question. You can design the officer class to be of a particular quality. You could have the command structures to be in a particular way. You could. In England, you have Irish Guards, you have Scots Guards, you have Welsh Guards. I don't know if they're all Welshmen, Irishmen, Scotsmen, but somehow they seem to sort of defend this country reasonably well. And so really, it is, I don't know where Clarides, I mean, not everything that Mr. Clarides said is wise. And I beg to differ. I think that is a standing army, a small army in the area in which we find ourselves in the Middle East, is an extremely good idea. How we do it is the question, and it's going to be part of a general solution to Cyprus problem, I think. Second point is, you know what used to be said about the British Empire was that the sun never sets on the British Empire, I think. So sunset clauses are a bit problematic because there is a real prospect, I think, that Turkey will not join the European Union, and therefore one's got to be realistic.
Yeah.
But I think moving to my third point, and it is this really, that we've got to think about what it means to have a treaty of guarantee. First of all, what is it in international law? Is such a concept known? How does it sit with United Nations resolutions, things of that sort? Thirdly, if you're going to think about treaty of guarantee, you've got to ask yourself, well, first of all, what is a guarantor? And secondly, what is it guaranteeing? What is a guarantor? A guarantor is a person who stands in the shoes of somebody else when that somebody else can't perform himself, basically. From the law of sort of financial guarantee, but I think it has the same idea in principle. But more importantly, I think, is, well, what is it guaranteeing? In the old days, it was guaranteeing the independence of Cyprus. Well, you know, what does that really mean in terms of the relations between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots? So far as the Turkish Cypriots are concerned, the guarantee is to do with the security of the Turkish Cypriots. That being the case, the next question is, well, is it really necessary? Why should it be necessary? Was it necessary for Russia to defend, I can't pronounce those states in Georgia, but you know what I mean. Russia, in my opinion, was acting perfectly lawfully because it accorded citizenship to some of them and said, well, I'm perfectly entitled under the principles of self-defense in international law to go and defend them. So the conclusion I come to actually is that in Cyprus we've got some sort of idea about these guarantees having some great significance. Actually, there was a British Attorney General who thought that they were unlawful because they didn't sit well with United Nations Constitution, actually. But I don't think that's necessary to me. I mean, Mr. Demetris might think that, you know, it sounds good and so on. He's got good ideas sometimes on the protection of the Turkish Cypriots, so you've got to respect what he says. On the other hand, actually, does Turkey really need in principles of self-defense and so on, does it really need, if the Turkish Cypriots are in any danger, any kind of treaty of guarantee? So I'm afraid I don't really, I think that we've got to think a bit more about what it means. What is its status? Has it happened? I mean, Sir Edward Clay might be able to shed light on this, I don't know, but is there any sort of international law basis upon which a guarantee is a known concept, given, for example, that countries have the right of hot pursuit, they have the right of self-defense, they have the right even to defend others sometimes. So maybe somebody should actually do a study on it. Why is it necessary? Could the same result be achieved by the law as it is at the moment? So far as the European Union is concerned and the external defense of Cyprus, well, actually, why is that an issue? If we have a proper standing army, which must be, in my opinion, a professional army, if it's well equipped, if it's up to date, if it's got good defense equipment, why can't we sort of make alliances and so on, depending on who our enemy is, as we go along? I mean, Britain used to make, I remember I did Bismarck and the alliances in my history when I was doing A-levels, I think. And Bismarck used to engage in all sorts of fanciful alliances, and it was only when they broke down that actually there was the First World War. But the point I'm really trying to make is that why can we not sort of see, well, who is our enemies? First of all, by the way, Iran is not the enemy of Cyprus. Iran may be the enemy of America in its dreams, but actually Cyprus has good relations with. Conceivably, who? But whoever it is, and whoever our enemy is, will make the alliance as and when the occasion arises. Why should we?
Right. Can we have your response?
I just want to finish this thing on NATO, and then you.
There are
No, there's a fourth point on NATO I want to make. I think it's completely irrelevant. Why should we be in NATO if it offends Russia? We get lots of money from Russians in Cyprus. We've got good relations with them. They don't like NATO. We don't like NATO. NATO has never done anything for us, and why should we be in NATO? So the question doesn't arise. Whether the British are in NATO and they might use the bases, of course they do. They provide the Americans with intelligence all the time. They provide bridges to do bridges all the time. They provide them with sort of air. They provide medical facilities for the soldiers in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And we have nothing against the enemies of NATO in either Afghanistan or in Iraq. We're on good terms with most people because our position is such. We have to be on good terms. So basically, the British use it as, but the British are part of Cyprus in a way, really. I mean, they've got the bases. We might get rid of them in the end by agreement, I hasten to add. They might reduce them. But the British are sort of reasonable people. I think they're quite reasonable on the basis now, actually. They're prepared to allow the bases to be developed. So, by the way, does anyone know that it's only the Cypriot government who's actually preventing that? The Brits want to develop the bases, except for the military areas. So those are my points. But basically, can we just sort of linger a bit on what it means to have a treaty of guarantee? Because I think maybe we're stuck in the language of the previous generation, and maybe the same result can be achieved without using those words.
I think, in many ways, you're very right. I mean, without wanting to get too far into a discussion, but I think that the way that we've seen the evolution of international law and ideas of intervention and legality and legitimacy as separate ideas over the past decade has been very instructive in all of this. There was a time when we took a very absolutist position in international politics, that sovereignty of states is paramount and must be respected under any and all circumstances. But obviously we saw in 1999 with Kosovo that there was a body of opinion that said even when the Security Council is not willing to authorise force, there's certain circumstances when there is a legitimate right to act, if not the legal right to act from it. And so I think, we have entered now a grey zone. Whether one that considers that good or bad, obviously there's differences of opinion. I have very, very grave concerns about the way that we're now recasting ideas of intervention in international politics. there's right-wing arguments, there's left-wing arguments. I take it, in actual fact, my own concern comes from the realpolitik argument that if it's good enough for us, it's good enough for Russia, it's good enough for China, and they can define the terms of their own intervention. And we've seen the consequences of it this summer.
Yeah.
We were able to act in Kosovo because we believed we had just cause. They said we had reason to believe we had just cause to act in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And I think it's a very, very dangerous route that potentially we're taking. But nevertheless, that debate is there. It's on the table to be had. And relating all of this to Cyprus, I think that there is an argument that Turkey would be in a position now to simply say, you know what, if the Turkish Cypriots attack, try and stop us. It may not be legal, but damn right, as we see it, it's going to be legitimate.
No, my point is that it may even be legal.
Well, I don't know if international law has moved on quite that far to legalise actions outside the Security Council, although, again, Kosovo's decision earlier this year has gone a hell of a long way, I believe, to knocking UN authority very, very severely. I don't think we've got to that stage yet, but I think we have crossed a first line, which is the idea that state sovereignty is sacrosanct under all conditions has now been increasingly questioned, not only for good reasons, I think, but also for bad reasons. So in that sense, I think Turkey would just simply say, you know what, if the Turkish Cypriots have been attacked, we're going to intervene because we have a right, you know, that's been established because of certain actions that have taken place, acting on principle, precedents, if you like, a common law version of international law, we're going to do the same.
Can I ask the lady over there to state a question? The young lady over there would like to ask a question. You want to still have a question?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I don't know if this is still relevant to what we were talking about, but what I wanted to say was that I think that before, I mean, in parallel with the process of finding a settlement, I believe that we should also look at the issue of identity in Cyprus. Like, I think we have a very big problem of identity, and we need to sort of find a way, or more focus needs to be placed on that issue. Maybe finding a common Cypriot identity or something, because I think that the role of civil society in this political process is very important, and it needs to come out more. And I think that that will, I mean, in this way, this will also better contribute to any settlement that and all the issues that you mentioned with the military, with national military, with external relations, and all of that. I think that's very important.
No, I think absolutely. I mean, you know, the simple fact is, and perhaps we lose sight of this, is if there's good relations between the two communities, most of these questions are answered. So, you know, I know it perhaps sounds as though it's going back to the most basic point, but sometimes it's really worth restating the most basic point. But look, if you get relations between the two communities off to a good start, that they can actually live together with one another, that they can forge good, meaningful ties with one another, then, you know, it's going to be a lot easier not just to deal with security issues, but practically every issue that you can imagine on Cyprus.
Aliki, I think you have a question.
A very short question on clarification, please. You mentioned an organisation about countries for peace. Do you remember the organisation you mentioned?
OSCE?
Yes.
Yes.
For which you said the current government of Cyprus does not want to be a member.
Oh, and that's NATO, right.
Can you please, first of all, clarify what the organisation is and why you believe the current government doesn't want to become a member?
Well, NATO.
What the inference was, basically.
Well, in that case, it was the element of talking about NATO, which was set up for mutual defence of the Western countries at the height, at the start of the Cold War, and essentially, I mean, the argument, and we've seen this is an argument that's been brought to the fore again over the course of this summer, was what purpose does NATO serve now that there is no Cold War? What has it just become a self-perpetuating military alliance, and what value does it have? But I mean, that's become particularly problematic because of ideas of trying to move the borders of NATO, the member states, right up to the borders of Russia, and Russia is very unhappy about this for all sorts of reasons. And ACL, having very close relations with Russia, having taken a non-aligned position during the Cold War, is very unhappy about now joining an organisation which it tends to take the same view of Russia as is potentially becoming more and more of a threat to Russia. So that is the reason why they are very opposed to NATO membership. It's ideologically driven in terms of the past, but also it's in terms of contemporary relations with Russia, that they want to maintain good relations with Russia. Russia's unhappy about NATO expansion. Russia would be very unhappy about any sort of idea that Cyprus would become part of NATO. So that's why essentially it's off the agenda.
I think you have a question.
Yes, building on the argument about the Cypriot identity, I personally believe that one of the problems in regards to the Cyprus issue is that we are trying to do everything at once. Like drawing on your argument on security, you've mentioned at the beginning that there is a non-balance, an asymmetry in the area. If you have a majority of Greek Cypriots which is surrounded by non-European, non-Christian countries, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria and Turkey, and people, the majority of people still feel Greek Cypriots, they do need a kind of army so as to feel secure. I mean, for me, an army is not only necessary for practical reasons, it's also necessary for psychological reasons, because so far many academics have suggested that partly the Cypriot issue is a psychological issue, and you cannot obviously convince people that they are just Cypriots and not Greek Cypriots or Turkish Cypriots, and it will be a long and painful process. I think it's an illusion to say, of course, yes, we need to work the relationships, but it's going to take a long time.
Well, I think this is part of the reason why I take a slightly different view on demilitarisation, notwithstanding the fact that it has been put forward by very eminent figures, is partly because, having lived in Cyprus for as long as I have, I do question whether ordinary Cypriots, certainly ordinary Greek Cypriots, would feel entirely happy about divesting themselves of a military force altogether. Maybe they can see the value of it in terms of promoting better relations with the Turkish Cypriots. But again, coming back to the point, I think that there are greater questions of overall security. And I think you're very right, the psychological element is important and does need to be considered and thought about. You know, having something there, I think in its own way also gives people a greater sense of confidence in that their future has been taken care of. It's a difficult question, and as I say, these are the sorts of things which are going to have to be thought about and discussed, and the balance offset, you know, the positives and negatives of any of these ideas have got to be weighed up against each other. But as you can perhaps tell, I mean, I certainly believe there should be a discussion on demilitarisation.
I would like to ask a question myself, and I'm referring to, there were some references to Ker-Lindsay's view. I think Ker-Lindsay once argued, perhaps even before he became president, that he could see the demilitarization of Cyprus and the replacement of the Greek and Turkish contingent stationed under the 1960 agreements replaced by an increased presence of amphicip, in which Greece and Turkey will be contributing contingents. So maybe this is a sleight of hand there, but it's a way of, since the Turkish military have so, in the last few years, so emphasized the security aspect of the Cyprus settlement, and since they play such a big role, they may not be willing to simply say, right, we'll withdraw our army and there is nothing Turkish there in Cyprus. They might be willing to accept the Ker-Lindsay idea, which was meant to be a compromise, I think, namely that these two countries contribute troops to an amphicip, which would be, I think Ker-Lindsay was very emphatic in saying that there would have to be a neutral general, I think, as he said, that is a general who won't be Greek or a Turk. But I suppose a Greek or a Turk could be, respectively, the company or the battalion commanders of their respective units.
Certainly an idea worth exploring. I mean, whether it could work well in practical terms, No, I think I lean towards your scepticism of it. But again, perhaps one can see a set of circumstances where even if that didn't happen immediately, that could also be something to aim for. That set down that if relations between Greece and Turkey have improved, then something like that might certainly become a feasible idea, that essentially you have Turkish and Greek contingents that remain there, get reduced to a certain size, and then perhaps folded into a peacekeeping force at some point in the future, so that they perform that role, and then you get rid of this idea of contingents altogether. I mean, that I think would be a very interesting idea, but whether it could be something that would be introduced from day one, and yes, you're right, I mean, this was essentially, Ker-Lindsay's argument would be to have channeled a lot of the money from Cypriot defence spending into increasing the size of UNFICYT, and then later on he suggested maybe a NATO peacekeeping force, and that Cyprus would help to pay for that.
I'm not very clear. I'm not very clear about. We're talking about the Cypriot army or contingents from Greece and Turkey.
Oh yes.
I understood you to be saying that the Cypriot state, as a state, should not have a standing army.
Yeah, no, that was the proposal.
It's a separate point.
That Cyprus would not have a standing army. The money that was being spent on defence would be channeled to having an improved and increased peacekeeping force, and then Greece and Turkey.
So there'd be no Cypriot army as.
No.
That was clearly
because I'm a bit surprised he said that. In Cyprus, I normally wouldn't intervene at this stage, but this is quite important point. One of the problems that used to happen in Cyprus before '74, since '74, of course, was not because it wasn't because there was an army of Greek Cypriots or an army of Turkish Cypriots. It's the opposite. It's because there was, and you have the irregulars. And they were not under central control, and they were controlled by sometimes gangsters, and that was the reason why, in the end, there was trouble. So actually, it's counterintuitive this, but I think it's valid. I.e., that actually, by having a properly structured army, you may be achieving a lot more than having no army and having armies in secret, which is what happened before.
Which the government themselves are frightened of, not just the Turkish Cypriots. But
can I ask, first of all, if there's anybody who hasn't raised a question in the past, in the last few minutes? Right, Mary. Sure.
It's not a coincidence really, but when I was editing the Defense of Cyprus report, we dwelt on security aspects for quite a lot, and I've just been flicking over what they said that you didn't say, but you, and the only thing I can find that's different is the international conference for the security of Cyprus, and I wondered whether you think that's a good idea or not. I mean, I agree with what Helen and Alpo are saying. Basically, you can have your own army that can be used externally or internally. It can be used for building bridges, building societies. It can be used in all sorts of ways.
You forgot about women soldiers.
It's
your usual subject.
Okay.
You're all okay with women
but I just wondered whether you thought an international conference for the security of Cyprus could start before a settlement is finished, or whether it awaits a settlement, or whether it's irrelevant. And that would bring in Greece and Turkey and the European Union and the Security Council, presumably.
Well, in fact, Mary, you touch on an important aspect that I didn't talk about at all, which is when do you get the ball rolling on this, and how do you get the ball rolling on this? And this is something that there is currently, and there was a working group on security issues that has been talking, but as far as I'm aware, I don't know what more serious discussions have been taking place. I would sincerely hope, and I presume, that discussions have been taking place internationally on this already at an informal level, or maybe at a formal level, we don't know. But I think that an international conference might actually be a very good idea, to bring all the parties round the table and say, look, if we're going, this is not about like arguing over the constituent parts of a settlement, if you like, but let's talk about some of the big issues of peacekeeping, of defence. How are we going to sort this out? And bringing all interested parties. So it would, essentially, we would include the P5 round that table, whether China would really want to get involved. They tend to, as you know, take a rather standoffish position on positions that don't necessarily directly affect them, although that is obviously starting to change. But I think that would be an important idea, and one that, again, would certainly be worth exploring and introducing a much more international dimension. I think certainly the Greek Cypriots would be a lot happier to have this as something which is much more international and involves all the members of the Security Council, certainly the permanent members of the Security Council.
Edward, Clay, I think you want something to add?
I'd just like to add one other thought, and that is that I absolutely agree that Turkey's accession to the EU, if it were to happen, a lot of things would become possible, which seem quite difficult to encompass at the moment. But what I'm against is the idea of building conditionalities and too many sort of sunset clauses, because the experience of Cyprus is that the more you elaborate agreements, the more the sides prove unable to get psychologically beyond them, which is why the 1960 package of agreements is clung to desperately. And it's very good for lawyers, but it's not much good for anybody else. And the trouble about sunset clauses is that instead of becoming deadlines, they become thresholds that both sides dares the other to cross. That's one problem. The other thing is that I think we shouldn't forget that Cyprus comes to the Security Council every 6 months. It has not been not seized of the matter for more than 40 years. There's no reason why that can't, as it were, be built into, or a continuation of it. But the 5 permanent members are always involved in that. And I think it'd be a very good thing to look at all the machinery to which Cyprus belongs as means of helping this common objective. And with perhaps a timetable. People need to be visionary. A period of years, and then you introduce Greek and Turkish forces, as a matter of course, into UNFICYP, instead of acting on the default presumption now that they cannot join. And making sure, for instance, that in monitoring an agreement, the OSCE is involved. Everybody belongs. Everybody can make a contribution, and it both gives an excuse to bring in people who are not generally invited now, but also make sure that they come only in diluted numbers. And I would just caution against any applause for the Russian action in Georgia. It's a very, very dangerous precedent for Cyprus, because it involved the distribution of a lot of passports to provide an alibi for intervention. Not a happy analogy.
Can I just say something about the guarantees again? They said, why are guarantees necessary? Well, as far as I'm concerned, I really do not see how they are necessary, because they've abused what they were supposed to be guaranteeing. I'm not taking away from the responsibility of Cypriots, and I'm not regarding Cypriots as children, but if one has the analogy of they were looking after a baby which they've abused, and then that baby is going to be put back into their hands under any form, to me is not acceptable, because I have, on an emotional level, suffered because of the guaranteed powers abusing all of them in their own specific ways. So I just can't see the argument of trying to keep Turkey, Greece and Britain in as guaranteed powers. Cypriots are sophisticated political people, as sophisticated as any other Europeans.
I don't know about that.
And they don't necessarily need guarantees. It's for the interest of those guarantors that they keep on being brought back in.
Right, I think we should bring the discussion to a close. I'd like to thank you all for being here, and on your behalf, I'd like to thank James Ker-Lindsay for his excellent contribution. Thank you very much. Anybody who would like to leave your email with me, I would be happy to put you on my distribution list. Anyone would like to be a member, please write to me. And if you want to remember us in your will, again, you are most welcome.
Can I also make a very quick announcement? In case anyone hasn't seen it, we actually at the Observatory have another event coming up on Tuesday, on the 14th, with Cypriots for Cyprus. developments in the peace negotiations in Cyprus, finding a solution by Cypriots for Cypriots. The speakers will include George Vassiliou, Ali Erel, Spiros Christou and Alev Adil, and that will be here at the LSE, and that's on at 6:30 in room D202, which is in Clement House. So that's Tuesday the 14th of October.